today we're basically going to engage on state-owned enterprises and the role of state-owned enterprises within the Big Four agenda, and particularly whether privatization of certain state-owned enterprises would lead to better growth in Kenya, economic growth in Kenya, whether the Big Four could actually benefit from state-owned enterprises, and how this would sort of fit in within Kenya's macro agenda. So within the context of the Big Four, we're looking at what is the most important aspects that would lead to its implementation. And in its implementation, a key part of it is looking at the public and private sectors. So one thing that we must look at is state-owned enterprises, which is sort of a jus milieu, an amalgamation of the two, of the public and private sectors combined. So what are state-owned enterprises? State-owned enterprises are basically state corporations. Well, in Kenya, they're very commonly referred to as state corporations. And what they are is that they're entities that engage in commercial activities, but are either fully or majority owned by the public sector, by the government. So in Kenya, we have about 187 government-owned entities, and that's in the sheet that we've also provided you with. But in terms of state corporations, which we're talking about today, which is actual entities that are engaged in commercial activity. So they're either generating revenues or creating a lot of significant economic value. There are about 34 commercial state corporations. And today I'll refer to them I'll use the word state-owned enterprises or state corporations, and in Kenya the most general use of the term is parastatal. But we have to be very careful in which ones we're talking about, because basically government-owned entities also include universities. Public-owned universities include agencies. But the ones that we're specifically referring to here are commercial state-owned corporations. And this could be part-owned, so majority-owned, or fully owned. And those are 34, according to the revised guidelines that was in the Parastatal Reform Committee. So when President Uhuru Kenyatta immediately came to power in 2013, one of the first things he did was institute a Parastatal Reforms Committee. And the report that came out of it basically reclassified the majority of government-owned entities. So we came out with 34 that were now determined as commercial. So why are these commercial state-owned enterprises, why do they exist? They exist primarily for four reasons. The first is that they address market failure. So they're there to address market failure, any gaps within the market that the private sector can't necessarily fix themselves. And they're also there to boost revenue and employment creation within the economy. And the last two things which are sort of linked is promoting indigenous business. So you have Kenya, which had state-owned corporations from the colonial period. But as a young nation, private capital wasn't necessarily available to extend to certain industries and certain sectors. And therefore what you had is government step in as the first mover, establish a lot of the infrastructure and establish a lot of the know-how and build indigenous business around it, so complementary. And I guess one of the most pertinent examples in that is the sugar industry. So you have complementary sectors, so you have the sugarcane farming, smallholder farming. And to boost that sector or the outcomes for sugarcane farmers, the government would set up a processing facility to absorb the feedstock and process it. The most recent example of this is in Makueni, where Governor Kivutha Kibwana has installed a juice processing factory to help smallholder farmers of mangoes. So the juice processing factory itself can be considered a county corporation, a county-owned corporation, and that's meant to basically improve the economic outcomes of the farmers. So that is one of the very key reasons that state-owned enterprises initially in the independence period were set up to sort of boost complementary sectors, improve infrastructure. But this was, the normative ideal, yeah? And it's important to understand the reasons of why state-owned enterprises were established in the first place, because that provides the foundation from which we begin to assess whether they should exist or not now. And that will build us a framework to understand how we can assess whether or not privatization would benefit the economy. But before we go into that, I would like to, there's another handout that we've given you, which is on sort of the image on the Big Four. And this is the context through which we're placing the discussion on state-owned corporations today. Now, the President's Big Four agenda has been on the top of everyone's mind in business and the economy for the last 2 years now. And what is at the crux of it is implementation. I mean, we're only going to see, this has been the biggest concern that has been in this country is whether or not we can actually implement the Big Four or not. Yeah, it's definitely sound on paper. It all makes sense, as the SOEs make sense. So implementation of the Big Four is going to be in the hands of the public sector and the private sector. Both are complementary, and the President has made it abundantly clear that the government on its own will be unable to deliver on the Big Four, and they must leverage quite significantly on the private sector. So with regards to both arms, with the public sector, what is the key determining variable that will influence implementation for the public sector? It's very simple. It's finance. It's the ability to finance the projects. It's the ability to finance infrastructure that is required to build out some of the key aspects such as affordable housing. And it's the finance also to provide capacity and empower the entities that are entrusted with the implementation of the Big Four. So finance for the public sector is the key variable that will influence the implementation. And for the private sector, it's incentives. So when we talk about incentives, we mean that for the private sector to directly engage in either one of the four big agendas, there must be incentives put in place that they receive the requisite amount of profit, or they foresee a large amount of profit to be gained from engaging in an activity in one of the four areas. So incentives are particularly important as a variable of influencing the implementation of the Big Four with regards to the private sector. Now, if we take it to another level, finance for the public sector, what is the biggest issue of finance right now? So more particularly public finance. And the most salient characteristic of the last 3 years when it comes to government finance and public finance has been debt. This includes not only the debt to GDP ratio, which has increased exponentially in the last 4 years, but also includes the intricacies of the negotiations behind the debt. So public debt with regards to the Big Four is quite significant. And we're looking at debt in terms of the financing of activities within government. With regards to incentives, the biggest issue there, if we take it to another level, is business costs. So if we speak and we engage quite widely with the private sector at the Kenya Business Guide, and we use an industry-led approach. And the biggest issues that are emerging with regards to the business environment in Kenya right now is the cost of doing business. So despite the successive improvements in Kenya's ease of doing business ranking, we have not seen a significant response from the private sector in terms of growth and expansion. And the reason for that is that 3 of the main costs associated with business are still not improving. That is tax, labor, and energy. And with regards to the Big Four agenda, because we're talking about a government-led development initiative, the most significant policy that can be put in place to allow incentives for the private sector are actually tax cuts. So if we look at the key variable as we're moving down this diagram, the tax cuts for the private sector will significantly determine how it involves itself with the Big Four. And the one cross-cutting factor that influences both the public sector and private sector's implementation of the Big Four is corruption. Now, alongside the Big Four agenda, corruption has been placed at the heart of President Uhuru Kenyatta's legacy. And corruption is intricately linked to both the public sector's delivery and the private sector's delivery. Now, I've mentioned this sort of framework with which we're discussing the whole Big Four agenda and how it's linking towards implementation. But how does state-owned enterprises, how do state-owned enterprises sort of fit within this context? So, if we take each of those three key variables, we can clearly begin to understand how state-owned enterprises will influence the implementation from the public sector side and the private sector side. So firstly, if we go to public finance, the Economist Intelligence Unit and various other analytical and research organizations have consistently stated, and we also have consistently stated, that one of the biggest budget-related risks in Kenya is the financial demands of struggling parastatals. So the financial demands of parastatals that are basically on the government's exchequer are significant and are putting a lot of pressure on the budget. The amount of money being absorbed by state-owned corporations far exceeds the amount remitted by them as tax to the KRA. In the last 4 years alone, capital grants to state-owned enterprises has increased 120%. That is from 169 billion in 2013 and 14 financial year to 414 billion in 2016 and about 345 billion in the last year. This is also in your fact sheet in the graph at the back. Now, just to put this into perspective, capital grants, so these are basically money allocations to state-owned corporations for operational expenditure or asset acquisition. So capital grants are not loans. It's simply a transfer of money from the treasury to the accounts of a parastatal upon request. And primarily they're used for operational expenditure, so they're not really used for productive means. And to put it into perspective, the capital grants to state-owned enterprises has reached about 5 to 6% of GDP, of Kenya's annual GDP. So we're talking about a significant fiscal concern when it comes to capital grants to SOEs. And the pressure levied by the SOEs on the budget is palpable. So this is what we talk about. So if we take that same framework that we're trying to understand with the Big Four, the public debt and the public finance aspects are being significantly pressured by capital grants to state-owned corporations. Now when it comes to tax cuts, so now we move to the private sector side. This follows on directly from the debt situation and the public finance. So to service the government's needs in finance, so either it's operational expenditure or development expenditure, financing the Big Four, financing state-owned corporations. There's two ways that they can do it. They can either borrow money from abroad or increase internal revenues. Internal revenues are primarily generated from tax. And borrowing, of course, is the accumulation of debt. Now, as you increase, if you look at Kenya's progression, the pressure to increase tax collection has increased exponentially in the last 5 years because of the accumulation of debt, but also because of the increasing needs of the budget. So if you look at the increase of capital grants to SOEs, that also is a proportional increase in the amount of tax that needs to be collected to service that. But what happens, or what has happened in Kenya, is that instead of increasing the tax base, so a significant increase in the tax base, there has been a squeeze of existing taxpayers. And a lot of the industry players, particularly in the manufacturing sector, are calling out a tax witch hunt on large taxpayers and increasing the rate at which they're paying tax. So squeezing the existing base to service the needs of the government. And when you look at the fiscal pressures that the government is facing, you can only see that tax and the increase in tax will be a significant threat to private sector development as we go forward. Because of the increasing needs from the government side. There is only so much that can be borrowed. Public debt particularly can be thought of with a metaphor of a hole in the ground and a mountain next to its side. The hole in the ground is the debt. So the debt will continue to increase, so the hole will continue to grow deeper. But if the mountain, which is what we call income, is growing at a larger rate than the hole is growing, the sand at the top of the mountain can be scooped to fill the hole of debt. But what happens with SOEs is that money that is used to fund their operational and expansion ambitions does not necessarily increase the size of the mountain because of the economic value or the mismanagement that is carried out with state-owned corporations. So we must look at whether the expenses in government and the capital grants are going to areas that are increasing resource efficiency and providing economic value that is able to fill that hole of public debt. And in the case of the private sector, the increasing accumulation of debt and capital grants and fiscal pressure that comes with it leads to tax increases that makes it more difficult for the business environment. So it's a whole cyclical approach to understanding how SOEs influence the implementation of the Big Four for both the public sector and the private sector. Now, the last thing I talked about was corruption. And corruption, of course, has been a vivid factor in Kenya's political economy. But particularly if we look at state-owned corporations, there has been controversies since independence on the management of state-owned corporations, or rather the mismanagement. And that has been a particular concern because mismanagement of SOEs basically means that any money transferred to SOEs or any bailouts given to SOEs are not used significantly to provide the net gain to the economy, where the money transferred to the SOEs is recovered and on top of that placed upon as sort of profits and returns to the government with increasing economic value to the country. And this is where privatization really comes onto the table, and it's something that we must begin speaking about, especially with regards to the Big Four agenda. For the SOEs, we must begin to inquire, why were they set up in the first place? So what was the reasoning behind setting up the state-owned enterprise in the first place? So if we take, for example, an agricultural processing state-owned enterprise, the initial reasoning behind setting it up may have been to prop up smallholder farmers and improve the linkages within the agricultural sector so that economic value is gained throughout the chain, so that the prices extended to smallholder farmers who are providing the feedstock are standardized, that their livelihoods are improved, and that they can improve their own practices and increase their incomes. So we must think then, for an agricultural processing SOE, has that been achieved? Is it being achieved? Or what is the current reasoning behind the existence of that state-owned corporation? And then the second big question that we must ask is that how much are they receiving from the exchequer? So from the treasury, how much are these institutions, these state-owned corporations, receiving from the exchequer? And how much are they remitting back through the KRA? Is there net loss or net gain? If it's a net loss, then we must begin to ask, why is it? Why is it that there is a net loss? And thus, the operations of the state-owned enterprise begin to come into play. Are the operations adding significant value to the economy? Or can they be replaced by a private sector driven entity? Now, privatization in that sense is basically giving up majority control. So if we privatize an entity, it could either mean doing full sort of privatization, which means that the entire entity is sold off to a private sector player, or it could mean selling a majority stake. In the case of Safaricom, for example, the government still retains a significant percentage of Safaricom, and Safaricom's dividends provide the government with a significant amount of revenue that goes straight to the treasury to finance activities. But key to assessing whether or not privatizing could alleviate any fiscal pressures facing the exchequer, and whether better management could create more economic value, and whether tax revenues would improve generally by privatizing it. So what we're trying to look at here is that with the fiscal pressures levied, if we privatize that entity, is it going to be managed to the state where taxes will improve? And therefore you're basically improving the fiscal pressures. Because what you've done there is you've not only removed the fiscal pressure of capital grants, but through improved management, you've increased another taxpayer. So the company then is able to pay more taxes to the KRA. And therefore your fiscal situation could potentially stabilize. And then with regards to the Big Four agenda, could the sale of this state-owned corporation and possible dividends received, so this could either be a full sale of the state-owned corporation where money received is directly put into a Big Four fund, or it's a part sale of the state-owned corporation where money is put into the Big Four fund and dividends are received on an annual basis from the effective management of that state-owned enterprise. Now, could that be a funding mechanism for the Big Four? Yeah, for the projects involved in the Big Four. And with that then, and this is particularly important, if you're alleviating fiscal pressures within government through either sales of state-owned corporations or restructuring of state-owned corporations, you're then providing space to enact tax incentives to the private sector. So it's a completely linked situation. Tax incentives are an imperative factor to improve the competitiveness and attractiveness of Kenya. But, and this is very crucial, to install or implement tax incentives, we must figure out how to improve the fiscal situation in government and alleviate some of the fiscal pressures currently levied on government. The only reason that we see a continuous increase in corporate tax and business tax is because the government needs to service its operational and development expenditure. But if there is a manner in which we can alleviate some of the fiscal pressures of the government, then tax incentives as a policy can become a reality. So tax incentives are directly linked to the current fiscal situation or the fiscal pressures that the government face. And let us make it very clear that tax incentives will be the biggest variable that will influence the participation of the private sector in the Big Four agenda. They must receive requisite amount of incentives, and particularly on tax. Now, this is why this whole conversation on privatizing state-owned corporations must go to the floor and must become common talk. Because privatizing the state-owned corporations, and this is not all of them, this must be done in a very pragmatic way. State-owned corporations provide, privatizing or restructuring state-owned corporations may provide a good solution to alleviating fiscal pressures in the government side and providing the space to allow private sector to increase. But state-owned corporations play a very critical role in employment creation throughout Kenya. So when we're assessing the role of state-owned corporations and whether we should also privatize or not, we must also look at the amount of employees that they currently have under their mandate. State-owned corporations are one of the largest employers in Kenya. And if we were to, let's say, privatize or give up some ownership of certain aspects, would that mean then retrenchment? And if retrenchment comes, we must also calculate the economic impact of retrenchment. Because in Kenya we live within a dependent economy and incomes move farther than the immediate family, retrenchment of individuals who are employed by government entities has a significant impact on the economy as a whole. Because the amount of consumption and consumer spending power significantly goes down. And we saw this in the 90s when we had the structural adjustment programs and there were significant retrenchments within ministries to sort of streamline the operational expenditure of government. And beyond that, how many state-owned enterprises are holding up a sector in terms of the entire value chain? There are significant state-owned enterprises in Kenya that provide the anchor for SMEs, for small enterprises, for smallholder farmers to feed directly into. So when we're assessing the state-owned corporation, the entire value chain could be a threat should it be privatized and restructured entirely. So when we're doing this, we must be very strategic in understanding where the policies must lie. But a fundamental principle is that without restructuring state-owned enterprises, we will not alleviate fiscal pressures in government. And therefore, we will not provide the space to enact policies such as tax incentives for the private sector. So we must understand the whole cycle within which the Big Four will be implemented and how state-owned enterprises actually feed into this.